do you want to go to Mars? It's a question that I can't count the number of times I've heard over the course of years, and I suspect that's the case for most of you as well. Sometimes the question is asked with almost an air of accusation to it, like, what do you find wrong with the rest of us? Why do you want to go to Mars? Or it's asked with that air of the sense that you're undergoing a psychological examination. They get that kind of amused look and ask you, why do you want to go to Mars? Like, okay, there's something that has gone seriously wrong with your psychological balance, and we'd like to know exactly what it was. And sometimes you actually get the question honestly. Now, the responses to the question can be as much fun as the way in which the question was phrased in the first place. And the answers, which I've heard over and over again through the course of years, have been what I like to break down in terms of categories of carrot and stick responses. The carrot replies to the question of why you want to go to Mars are put forth in terms of all the benefits that we're going to receive, either individually or as a species, or even in terms of the benefit for life as a whole. That there's something good that's going to come from the idea of traveling to Mars, and that's therefore why we want to go, ought to go, will go. Then there are the stick replies, the or else category of, if you don't go to Mars, then the following bad things are going to happen. These tend to be rather heavily emphasized within the media and are usually operating from the perspective that a lot of things happen in our culture, which is do this or else. This is a crisis, or this is something worth spending capital on, because if we don't, then dire consequences will result. The stick scenarios are legion. A few of them fall within the broader categories of human pandemics that might end the race, to the idea of a meteor impact which annihilates human civilization or even all life on Earth, or a decline in material resources on Earth which traps mankind on one world, even as the results of our civilization choke the world to death. And various variations of those themes and more. There's been a great deal of creativity in this regard. But fear of annihilation, in other words, the whole category of stick responses to the question, why do you want to go to Mars, are an artifact of sentience and moral sensibility. There's no evidence that plankton, platypuses, pachyderms fear the extermination of their species in particular, or life in general. Such fears fall within the domain of people. Thus, as I've noted, various scenarios have been set forth in defense of humanity becoming an interplanetary civilization. And many of those scenarios find their justification in obviating, or at least ameliorating, the effects of events which could bring about the end of life on Earth. In short, Mars has become something of a lifeboat in such argumentation, or even a step on the way to the immortality of our race. Thus, for example, one writer opined, while contemplating the purported inevitability of our extinction if we simply remain on Earth, he commented this in the following way. Life must be part of the natural processes of stars and planets, but it can also be snuffed out by those same impassive, relentless processes. Will life be erased from our planet, bowled away by our sun's remorseless expansion? And if it is, will there be other intelligences watching our tragedy, mourning our star's death, wondering if life existed on the worlds of that distant star, wondering if they are alone in the universe? Or will we, in the fullness of time, expand our habitat beyond the Earth, even beyond the solar system, and spread our seed among the stars themselves? This is the path to humanity's immortality. An interesting appeal. Once we begin, he continues, to build self-sustaining habitations beyond the Earth, we'll have detached the fate of humanity from the fate of the Earth. Once we have learned how to reach other stars, we'll have detached our fate from the inevitable doom of the sun. End quote. Now, on a surface level, there's almost an absurdity to this kind of a meditation on the eventual demise of Earth, when examined from the standpoint of a secular mind. First and foremost, one might expect any individual to say, well, so what? What does that have to do with me? Because remember, the context for that particular lifeboat scenario was, you know, someday the sun is going to explode. Yeah, but what's more likely to be the threat to you is the means of transportation which you use leaving this conference. So why do we care? Because people do. Regardless of what philosophical framework they're coming from, many people understand the appeal, at the very least, of this kind of argumentation. Even though most Americans can hardly be cajoled into saving for their retirement, nevertheless, they can express concern about the fact that eventually the sun is going to go out. Why do we care? What might happen to a humanity and to life itself, which is more distant in time from us than our own mythic past is distant from us chronologically. One of the greatest figures who lived at the cusp of mythic antiquity, Sargon of Akkad, has been dead for nearly 4,300 years, if you can see that he ever lived at all. But if we look forward a similar span of time to Anno Domini 6300, we would still be countless millennia removed from such a time of the end of the world in that particular scenario. And we would be speaking of a civilization or civilizations as far removed from our own as that of the Akkadians. And yet, even in the age of the Akkadians, the fear of annihilation had already arisen. The curse of the Akkad, the reality of which has been upheld to a degree by archaeology, set forth a fate which they feared in their own time, which described the end of their world. To quote from that so-called curse of the Akkad. For the first time since cities were built and founded, the great agricultural tracts produced no grain. The inundated tract produced no fish. The irrigated orchards produced neither syrup nor wine. The gathered clouds did not rain. The mascarum did not grow. At that time, 1 shekel's worth of oil was only 1/2 quart. 1 shekel's worth of grain was only 1/2 quart. Those sold at such prices in the markets of all the cities. He who slept on the roof died on the roof. He who slept in the house had no burial. People were flailing at themselves from hunger. End quote. We need to face the reality then that the fear of the end of all things is as old as human civilization, which is to say, as far back as time gives us history. This fear has been present in one form or another. So this brings us then to the idea of this Martian lifeboat, which has become, in a sense, kind of a haunt for preppers with PhDs. Seriously, everything from the death of the honeybee to the theory of global climate change to the looming threat of killer asteroids to mass death by means of nanotechnology, these and countless other scenarios have been offered up as proof, in at least a conceptual framework, is the need to spread the human race among the stars. The end which men fear remains largely the same as it was in ancient times. But the means by which mankind fears that such an end may come to pass have certainly become more colorful. In recent decades, popular culture in the West has manifested a particularly active obsession with the end of the world. The number of books, television series, and movies which have set forth the end in one form or another is almost beyond enumeration. And you have only to look at the ratings that such things receive to see that it strikes a common chord among those who are receiving those forms of entertainment, if you can actually call the death of man a form of entertainment. Everything becomes theater. And we see that this fascinating aspect of the obsession seems to have only become stronger since the end of the Cold War. That is, after the period in which the world was ostensibly living under a persistent threat of global nuclear destruction. In the very time period in which such fears should have been, presumably decreasing, human beings seem to have become only more obsessed with various impending forms of universal catastrophe. The theater of Y2K and 2012 preparations simply gave a concretization of fears which underlie much public discourse. Elite culture may sneer at such preppers, but they're not substantially different in terms of the mentality from that which sets forth a wide variety of disasters which may befall Earth and necessitate a Martian lifeboat. Part of the reason why such a multiplicity of fears is manifested at this time is found in the tension introduced by the end of teleology, which has been set forth by evolutionary theory. When the highest end of any form of life is to serve as a transitional form on the road to nowhere, sentient beings recoil in horror. There are, in fact, the choices presented by such ideology. Either humanity is not a transitional form and thus will simply become extinct in the fullness of time, or it is a transitional form and will thus simply become no longer extant in a meaningful sense, and will instead have been replaced by creatures which view humanity with no more sense of kinship than one might express toward an opossum. The only escape from such an ideology is one which is given by this duality, is one in which simply continued existence is enough. An expanse of generations in which substantial biological transformation does not transpire, and yet somehow the species avoids elimination. Such an existence would continue to be without inherent virtue or purpose, save for the negative virtue of having avoided extermination. Mankind would simply, in that sense, go on existing. The existence of sentient life being its own virtue in a universe which many people believe to know of no such thing as an objective virtue. Thus the reasoning reduces to the declaration. It is a good thing for mankind, humankind, to go on forever simply because we say it is a good thing. Ouroboros devours his own tail. Attempts to collapse the source and character of such fears of an annihilation of the species to some sort of biological imperative to survive ultimately fails, since the species is, from an evolutionary perspective, an abstraction at best. A human being is capable of both murder and self-sacrifice from the standpoint of the preservation of life which is personally dear to us, our own lives or that of our progeny. Concerns for the survival of the species are abstruse and can even be difficult to cogently enunciate without appeals to teleological reasoning. And the reason for this is simple. Human beings have a teleological imperative implicit in their understanding of their own lives. As Lewis Mumford observed this fact in quite simple terms, and I quote, "Meaning lives and dies with man, or rather with the creative process that brought him into existence and gave him a mind." End quote. Now, by teleological imperative, what is meant is that human beings have a fundamental need for purpose in their own lives and in the lives of others, and for humanity as a whole. Man's biological imperatives are often narrow in scope and few in number. To the extent that one would give credence to Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, one readily perceives that one ascends through the hierarchy. As one ascends through the hierarchy, the social and cultural character of human beings becomes more apparent and more indispensable. If a human being is going to do more than simply exist, a sense of purpose and a sense of fulfillment of that purpose gives order to existence on both an individual and social level. The moment a human being can contemplate his existence and ask, "Why am I here?" the game is up for simply dismissing the question with an invocation of biological imperative. Because even a nihilistic rejection of the question is still a spiritual process. The one who declares, "I have concluded that my life is without meaning," hasn't escaped the teleological imperative, because if nothing else, his existence has been spent in proving his own inconsequential character, however depressing such an analysis would prove to be. Sometimes, in the case of various secular ideologies, take Marxism-Leninism for example, the teleological imperative is expressed in ostensibly secular or scientific terms, such as the pseudoscientific economics of class warfare. But ultimately, even such a dry interpretation of human existence and meaning leads to a pseudo-theological eschatology of the final state of man being, in that particular model, communism. In short, even the godless Marxists need a sense of meaning, both in their own lives and in the life of the whole of the species. On the experiential level, it is to be perceived as, again, Mumford wrote, meaning lives and dies with man, or rather with the creative process that brought him into existence and gave him a mind. On a fundamental level, apart from humanity and our perception of meaning, what meaning does life on Mars, or life on Earth, for that matter, possibly have that can be deduced by human reason and yet would endure in the absence of human consciousness? It becomes impossible to define an intrinsic meaning to life which avoids relying on sentience to establish the criteria of such meaning. Furthermore, the meaning of life is not a solipsistic affair. The meaning of life is the focal point of civilizations, both real and potential. Groups large and small are organized around shared notions and expressions of such meaning. Scriptures, constitutions, philosophical treatises, manifestos, and also holidays, anthems, flags, polities, on and on it goes, through shared histories, both real and imagined, and a myriad of other norms and expressions of culture. These are the native soil of culture and civilization. And apart from such culture, there is no humanity in any sense which has meaning. To again quote from Mumford, we capture the sense of it as follows. When he says, man might even be defined as a creature never found in a state of nature, for as soon as he becomes recognizable as man, he is already in a state of culture. End quote. There is no culture without cultus. Is it any wonder that this Latin root word is, cultus is found in the perfect passive participle of colo, that is to till or cultivate or to worship. We found an interesting Latin root. The same word for cultivation is that which is used for worship as well. Because culture is bound to civilization and is the meeting point of cultivation and communion. Language is the technology of culture and is in fact inseparable from it. Language is the right of discourse, liturgy the highest form of language. Language binds men of one culture and distinguishes them from another. In its highest form, it is used to speak of that which is at the heart of the civilization, and thus for the believer is to hear the word, in that to hear the voice of God. It is the technology of the public square and the instrument of the divine. Language is both how and why we live, and there is no life of man apart from language and therefore culture. Thus, when we consider the end of the world, what we're actually speaking of is the end of culture, the end of language. When there is no one to speak or to write, no one to hear or to read, then the world is ended. The waves may crash, and the birds may sing, and the trees may fall in the forest with no one to hear them, without ears to hear, and eyes to see, and minds and souls to know their meaning. The world would have ended. We didn't need to fear a supernova or a killer asteroid or things that go bump in the night. For without human beings, there is no culture. The world, in the meaningful sense, would have ended. Culture is bound to civilization. The words of culture are given expression in the life of a civilization. Thus, the generations which constitute civilization are bound together by the words of culture. And we're eager to hear those words from elsewhere. A number of years ago, when the 50th anniversary of the SETI program was being recognized, one science writer observed at the time that there were those who saw this need to find someone else to hear, someone else to talk to, as perhaps a mark of the infancy of our race. In other words, maybe this doesn't matter in the long term. That may be true. But for man, now, as a species, it is something which we perceive to be of great importance and great necessity. For we see the value of communication not only with the living of our own race, but also with the dead. Communication of civilizations long dead may require a Rosetta Stone, but countless thousands of individuals were prepared to search for hundreds of years until a point of connection could be found. And these desires to find life elsewhere, you really have simply a continuation of that same drive of looking for someone to talk to and to listen to those who are not part of our immediate experience. That's the point. As long as a past civilization can speak to us, there is a sense in which it is still alive. There is no lifeboat more famous than that of Noah. Maybe he has something to teach us on this occasion. We're told of the ritually unclean animals that there were 2 of each kind in the ark. That's a number that appeals to biologists and the theologians. It's a number of union. So too, there were 7 among the clean species as well. Not of as much interest to biologists, perhaps. But it's interesting that to man was allotted a different number, of community, of 8. A number which is one of redemption. Because what man was perceiving himself to need, and which he needed, was not simply survival, but redemption, purpose, meaning. And so as we saw from the beginning of this presentation, as language provides the meeting point of civilization, so those things written over 3,000 years ago can continue to speak to and shape our own civilization, because no one needs to have the concept of an ark explained to him or her. Mumford is correct. There is no state of nature for human beings. We exist in defined time, in relationship with other human beings, culturally bound to those who share a common cultus, culture, and language. Without the language of our civilization, our knowledge of that civilization is impoverished. Again, quoting Mumford a lot on this one, but he's got a number of points worth mentioning. He observed that material artifacts may stubbornly defy time, but what they tell us about man's history is a good deal less than the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth. If the only clue to Shakespeare's achievement as a dramatist were his cradle, an Elizabethan mug, his lower jaw, and a few rotted planks of the Globe Theatre, one could not dimly imagine the subject matter of his plays, still less guess in one's wildest imagination what a poet he was. Though we would still be far from justly appreciating Shakespeare, we should nevertheless have a better notion of his work through examining the known plays of Shaw and Yeats and reading back them. This is true of all culture. The word gives form, defines the work, and evaluates what's been made. Footprints on the moon and a burned-out descent stage would tell the future very little of the heart of our age, apart from the words which speak to the character of our times. And the multitudinous reasons how and why we traveled to the moon are inseparably bound up with each other. If it did not matter why we went, we would never have gone. So if we were to view Mars as a lifeboat, it needs to be one for civilization. Since human existence and human civilization are inseparable, perhaps what is most needed is to protect civilization itself. Biological organisms are hardy, and after a fashion, so are civilizations. But as biology is about existence sustained within certain finite parameters, temperature, nutritional requirements, light, various other parameters, so too culture exists within parameters. And just as there is a sense of impoverishment with a species becomes extinct, something is lost when cultural depth is lost. Short of time, let me skip ahead. Civilization provides structure, not only for technological development, but for the entire way in which groups of humans perceive their purpose and cultural and moral values. The end of civilization is a more perceptible threat, especially when viewed from the perspective of the current predominant civilizations of our modern age. The world in which we live is not only the time in which human beings have become most aware of the fragile character of biological life, it is also the age in which they have become aware of the threat which ideology may pose to civilization. Ours is an age which is not only marked by technological advancement, but by book burning, the gulag, the mass grave. It is a world which spawns cautionary tales, such as George Orwell's 1984, Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451. Totalitarian authoritarian governments lied with little fear that they would be confronted with the truth. Life and civilization are both endangered by the lie, therefore. And yet, as we've been reminded by the poets, one word of truth outweighs the world. Life and civilization are endangered by the lie, not in an abstract way, like a comet might strike the Earth in 1,000,000 years, or a supernova might occur in 100 million years. The lie which attacks the bedrock of civilization assaults life itself, slaughtering human beings by the hundreds of billions and despoiling the Earth. Mars does not provide a lifeboat simply in the sense of a refuge where one might hide from the evils which human beings unleash upon one another. It could be a lifeboat that provides one of the most important catalysts to human civilization, distance, both real and imagined, for human beings to reflect on the heritage which comes down to them from across generations. It gives the chance to do so, as many civilizations have done before, by consciously emulating what is perceived to be the best of that which has come before, even while adding those insights which are peculiar to our own age. As we consider the new frontiers which stretch out in front of us, I will observe that we recently observed the 45th anniversary of the Apollo 11 mission to the moon, which gives us an opportunity to reflect on mankind's first steps into a much larger universe. When Aldrin went to the moon, he carried a small card with him which quoted from Scripture. The text of it reads as follows: Jesus said, "I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever remains in me and I in him will bear much fruit, for you can do nothing without me." And then Aldrin quoted from Psalm 8, "When I consider thy heavens, the work of thy fingers, the moon and the stars, which thou hast ordained, what has meant thou art mindful of him, and the Son of Man, which thou visitest him." It is a private confession of faith by one astronaut. A confession which Aldrin himself later attested was perhaps not as well thought out as he might have liked, in that nothing would remain in private of the details of that historic mission. There is something symbolic in his action. For we all carry words in our pockets, so to speak, words which come to us from across the generations, which guide the steps of the living, according to admonitions first proclaimed in ages past. Aldrin's words were well chosen, in a time marked by the hubris of humanity, in which the powerful often live as if there would be no accounting for their actions. These are words which inspire hope, and which also set the limit for the course of human action. An Athenaeum standing on the red planet would help to remind future generations of the unchanging bedrock beneath our own feet. Human beings inhabit a world which is ordered, and we perceive it to be such, in which we perceive purpose and reason for our own individual existence, but even more importantly, for life itself. We are living in eager expectation of the revealing of the sons of God, as Scripture admonishes us. Purpose isn't an illusion. It is more sure foundation than the earth beneath our feet. And those who have a hope not limited to the kingdoms and ages of men, thus establishing the gospel of the kingdom, live a life out in hope, which is ours through that which is known by divine revelation. He only is our rock and our salvation. He is our defense in which we shall not be. Thank you for your attention. We're running over a little bit, but previous speaker was understandably a little bit long, so these things tend to slide a little bit. Do I have time to take one or two questions?
What is your questions? Is good.
I agree. Apologies for the brevity of it. Yes.
Do you think we should go to Mars?
Absolutely, yes. And as I endeavor to explain, but not for the reasons that maybe others do. I believe that preserving civilization is preserving life, and that we benefit from the spread of civilization at least as much as.
So Mars is kind of like an ark.
It's a lifeboat, isn't it? Yeah, potentially. Yeah, and again, that's been our experience in the past, is continuing life by continuing civilization. Questions? Thank you for your